After my dad's funeral, my brother-in-law took over of my dad's company and $500 million, arrogantly stating, "From today onward, this company is mine, and all you get is your dad's old truck." However, when I started the truck's engine, the navigation system suddenly activated, guiding me to a location preset by my dad. I was surprised when I arrived because a big surprise was waiting for me. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Also, can you believe it is already 2026? Happy New Year to this amazing family. I hope this year brings you strength and new beginnings. If you want to support the channel and see more stories like this, please show some love in the comments.
It really helps us grow.
Now, back to the story. It was raining. Naturally, it was. Richard stood beneath a massive black umbrella, looking more like a man celebrating a jackpot than someone mourning his father-in-law. He flicked the keys toward. They were uneven, corroded, and carried the faint scent of humiliation. "Stick to your flowers, Morgan," he said with a smirk, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. "Let the men handle the business." I didn't yell. I didn't let him see me break. I simply wrapped my fingers around the cold steel until it pressed painfully into my skin, turned away from the empire I had poured myself into, and slid behind the wheel. The van carried the sharp trace of peppermint gum mixed with stale tobacco. My father. The scent hit like a memory grenade the moment. I shut the door, sealing myself inside a metal shell that felt less like transportation and more like a coffin. For one fragile heartbeat, my throat tightened. I wanted to fold forward, press my forehead to the steering wheel, and drown in the grief clawing up my chest. Then I checked the rearview mirror. Richard was still standing on the mansion's porch, his mansion now watching me drive off. And he was smiling. That smile burned away my tears. Grief was indulgent. I couldn't afford indulgence. Anger, though, anger was combustible. And I was running on it. I twisted the key. The engine hacked and sputtered like it might give up, then roared awake in stubborn defiance. I shoved the gearshift forward and rolled down the gravel driveway, refusing to glance back. Stick to your flowers. As if tending life were weakness. As if building something from bare soil weren't the most grueling labor a person could undertake. For 3 years, while cancer hollowed my father from the inside, I was the one swapping 4 bags. I calibrated morphine doses. I held his hand. When the agony scrambled his memory and he forgot his own name. Richard?
He was golfing, networking, slowly suffocating the company while he waited for the inevitable. He believed the illness
dulled my father's perception. He thought morphine blurred the edges of reality. But my father missed nothing. He knew who carried the basin when he was sick. He knew who carried the checkbook when he wasn't looking. As the estate's iron gates shrank in the rearview mirror, my thoughts drifted to Samantha, my sister. She had stood shoulder to shoulder with Richard during my public humiliation. Silent, motionless, she hadn't defended me. She hadn't even met my eyes. Years ago, that silence would have shattered me. I would have labeled her cruel, but as the coastal road curved ahead, something colder settled in. Samantha wasn't cruel. She was conditioned. Richard hadn't just seized the company, he had occupied her mind. Over the years, he had reframed cruelty as ambition. He had marketed narcissism as leadership. He had methodically redefined emotional abuse as executive pressure until she could no longer separate devotion from captivity. In her world, protecting the victim was betrayal of the ruler. She was imprisoned without visible bars, too frightened to even test the lock. I wasn't only driving away from her. I was leaving her inside the beast. Halfway to the highway, the dashboard flickered. The radio crackled through the silence, then died. The digital clock blinked 12 o'clock. The center console screen glowed to life. It wasn't the original factory system. It was a newer GPS unit awkwardly embedded into old plastic. It emitted a sharp beep. A single destination appeared. No address. No coordinates. Just 2 words pulsing in green text. Point Z. My father's voice echoed in my memory, steady, unmistakable. Drive carefully, Mo. You know the way. A chill slid down my spine. Unrelated to the air conditioning, I didn't turn toward my apartment. I tightened my hands around the wheel and veered toward the coastline. The funeral hadn't concluded the game. It had triggered it. The GPS led me off smooth pavement and onto a narrow gravel path that scarred the cliffside. The ocean below churned violently, gray waves smashing against rock, mirroring the storm inside me. Point Z wasn't a bank. It wasn't a lawyer's office. It was the old lighthouse warehouse decommissioned decades ago, where my father had parked his very first truck 40 years earlier. The structure sat alone on a stretch of wind-beaten headland. Its paint flaking, the Titan Logistics logo faded into a ghost across corrugated metal. To anyone else, it was DK. To Richard, it was probably a line item waiting to be liquidated. To me, it was sacred ground. I killed the engine. Silence pressed in, broken only by wind slipping through cracks in the siding. I reached into the glove compartment for the flashlight and stepped out. The key Richard had tossed at me wasn't alone on the ring. A smaller key hung beside it. It slid into the warehouse padlock with a precise click. The heavy steel door groaned open. I braced for the stench of abandonment. Instead, I smelled Earl Grey tea. My mother sat at a folding table in the center of the cavernous space. One industrial lamp illuminated her, casting long shadows against the walls. At the funeral, she had trembled, leaning on Richard for balance, dabbing at tears with a handkerchief. Now she sat upright, composed, reading a file. Her eyes were dry, her hands didn't shake. "Close the door, Morgan," she said evenly. It was the voice of the woman who once balanced company books when the business consisted of 2 trucks and blind faith. I stood there, stunned. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "Richard thinks you're at the estate." "Sedated," she replied calmly, shutting the file and nodding toward a fireproof safe beside her chair. "Richard believes exactly what we've allowed him to believe. He thinks I'm a fragile widow who will sign anything placed in front of me. He thinks you're a defeated gardener destined to disappear quietly. He's wrong on both counts." I approached the safe slowly. "Why?" I whispered. "Why did Dad let this happen? Why hand Richard the company? Why leave me nothing but that van?" She rose and placed a steady hand against my cheek. "He didn't leave you nothing, Morgan," she said. "He left you the weapon." And then she told me everything. My father hadn't been oblivious to Richard's greed. He had been studying him. If he had fired Richard outright, the fallout would have been catastrophic. Richard would have sabotaged the company out of spite, leveraging debt, tanking reputations, dragging Samantha down with him. Richard had embedded himself as the company's structural pillar. Remove him too abruptly, and the entire framework would collapse. So Dad chose patience. He needed Richard to feel victorious. He needed him to feel safe. To believe the old man was too sick to notice the embezzlement, too weak to retaliate. Arrogance was Richard's blind spot. He didn't fear me because he dismissed me. He wouldn't inspect the van because he considered it worthless. My father constructed a Trojan horse out of rust and silence and waited until he was buried to launch the counterstrike. My mother turned the safe's dial. Click. The door swung open. "It wasn't an insult," she said softly. "It was a transfer of command." I spent the entire night reading. Inside the safe were 2 items: a leather-bound notebook filled with my father's handwriting and a hard drive labeled Shadow Books. The notebook wasn't sentimental. It was evidence. For 5 years, my father had documented everything, every suspicious withdrawal, every falsified invoice, every shell corporation quietly registered in the Cayman Islands. Richard wasn't incompetent. He was parasitic. He had siphoned millions to feed a gambling addiction spiraling beyond control. High-stakes poker games in Macau, losses in Monaco. Each deficit patched by siphoning funds from employee pensions and securing predatory loans against company assets. But the true horror wasn't theft. It was fabrication. I uncovered a stack of loan documents signed by Samantha. Her signature looked flawless, too. Flawless. Digitally copied and pasted across multiple applications. Richard had engineered a trap. If creditors came knocking, Samantha would take the fall for fraud she didn't even know existed. Something inside me crystallized. This wasn't about reclaiming money. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about war. This wasn't about my pride anymore. It wasn't about the insult at the funeral or the rusted van. This was a rescue mission. Richard had turned my sister into his human shield. I looked up from the papers. The sun was rising over the ocean, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. My mother was asleep in a chair wrapped in a blanket. She looked peaceful for the first time in years, unburdened by the secret she had kept to protect us. I walked to the window. Outside, Thurston Van sat in the tall grass, catching the first light. It looked sturdy, unpretentious, dangerous. Richard saw a gardener when he looked at me. He saw someone who played with dirt, someone small and inconsequential. Hadn't realized that gardeners know exactly how to prune a disease before it kills the whole tree. He didn't know that we aren't afraid to get our hands dirty. I closed the notebook. The fur that had lived in my chest since the funeral evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. Richard had built his empire on lies and leverage. He thought was untouchable because he held the keys to the castle, but he didn't know. It held the blueprints to the foundation, and I knew exactly where to plant the dynamite. I didn't storm the castle, not yet. I went back to work. I put on my muddy boots and my canvas jacket, and I spent my days designing Zen gardens and pruning roses for the wealthy clients Richard despised. To the world, I faced defeated sister, the one who had accepted her lot in life. To Richard, I was invisible. That was my greatest advantage. While Richard was busy buying a 70-foot yacht, heckling a Ford and firing the logistics managers who dared to question his vision, I was busy meeting them. I used the operational cash from the safe, my father's war chest, to hire the best forensic accountant in the state. Then I started making calls. I met the old guard, the board members Richard had ousted or alienated in places Richard would never set foot in. Greasy spoons in the highway, public parks, the back of my nursery. I drove the rusted van to every meeting. It became a symbol. When I pulled up, they didn't see a failure. They saw Robert's daughter driving Robert's truck. They saw continuity. They saw respect. I showed them the shadow books. Not all of it, just enough to scare them. Just enough to prove that their dividends were being funneled into a black hole in Monaco. One by one, their skepticism turned to rage. One by one, they signed their proxy votes over to me. Meanwhile, Richard was unraveling. The accounts he tried to drain were suddenly freezing up thanks to the quiet injunctions my lawyer was filing. He was bleeding cash and losing control, and he didn't know why. Heckled me late one night, his voice luring with expensive scotch. "I need you to sign some papers, Morgan," he demanded, skipping the pleasantries. "Just some restructuring forms. For the state. I need to liquidate a few legacy assets to streamline operations." "I don't understand these legal things, Richard," I said. "Playing the part perfectly. You know I'm not good with business. Maybe we should wait until the quarterly board meeting. I can bring them then." "Don't be stupid," he snapped. "Just sign them and I'll give you $5,000. Buy yourself some new shovels." "I'll see you at the meeting, Richard," I said and hung up. I looked at the calendar on my wall. The quarterly meeting was in 3 days. I had the votes. I had the evidence. I had the element of surprise. Richard Thoth was walking into a coronation. Hadn't known he was walking into an execution. The quarterly board meeting was held in the glass-walled conference room on the top floor of the Titan Logistics Tower. Richard sat at the head of the mahogany table looking worse for wear. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie was loose, and he radiated the desperate aggressive energy of a cornered animal. He didn't look like a CEO. He looked like a man trying to outrun a tsunami. "Let's get this over with," he barked, not even looking at the agenda. "I'm moving to dissolve the current board structure and consolidate executive OPER. We need agility, not committees." The room was silent. The remaining board members, the few sycophants he hadn't fired yet, looked nervous. They knew the company was bleeding, but they were too afraid to speak. The heavy double door swung open. I walked in. I wasn't wearing my canvas jacket. I was wearing a tailored navy suit that cost more than Richard's yacht deposit. Behind me worked 2 men, Arthur Sterling, the forensic accountant, and Detective Miller from the fraud squad. Richard looked up confused. Then he laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. What is this? Bring your daughter to work day. Go back to your flowers, Morgan. The adults are talking. I didn't say a word. I walked to the front of the room, plugged my laptop into the presentation stemmed and projected a single image onto the massive screen behind Richard. It wasn't a graph. It was a scan of a loan application for $5 million signed by Samantha. Next to it, I projected the digital metadata, proving the signature had been copy-pasted from a birthday card. I'm not here to talk about flowers, Richard, I said, my voice calm and carrying to every corner of the room. I'm here to talk about the $40 million you embezzled. Richard's face went white, then red. He stood up so fast, his chair tipped over. You're lying. This is proprietary data security. Sit down, I said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. I own the debt, Richard. I bought outstanding loans this morning. I control 60% of the voting shares and I have the shadow books. I clicked their remote. The screen filled with rows of numbers, his secret withdrawals, his gambling losses, the shell companies. The room gasped. Richard looked at the screen, then at me, then at the door, and then he broke. It wasn't anger. It was a collapse. The narcissistic injury, the moment the false self, the genius CEO, the big man shattered into a million pieces. He didn't attack me, Hester did, crying. Not tears of remorse, but tears of self-pity. It wasn't my fault, he screamed, his voice cracking. The market turned. I was trying to save us. It was your father. He set me up. Henyu. He wanted me to fail. Then he turned on Samantha, who had just walked in the door. And you never supported me. You just wanted the money. I did this for you. He was unraveling, blaming everyone but himself, shrinking before our eyes until he was just a small, pathetic man in an expensive suit. He looked at me, begging, Morgan, please. We're family, don't do this. I looked at him, cold as the ocean. We aren't family, Richard. You're just a bought investment. I nodded to Detective Miller. He's all yours. Richard waistcoated out in handcuffs, screaming about lawyers and conspiracies until the elevator doors finally slid shut, cutting off his voice. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the projector. Samantha stood by the door, staring at the screen where her forged signature glowed in high definition. She looked at it for a long time, then she looked at me. The spell was broken. The years of gaslighting, of being told she was crazy, of being Madetto feel small so Richard could feel big. It all shattered under the weight of undeniable proof. She didn't scream. She wept. It was a quiet, devastating sound, the sound of someone mourning the years they had lost. I walked over and put my arms around her. I'm sorry, she whispered into my shoulder. I'm so sorry, Mo. It's okay, I said, holding her tight. He's gone. We're safe. In few weeks that followed, the company went through a painful but necessary detox. I took the CEO chair temporarily, just long enough to stabilize the ship. Irid Arthur Sterling as the CFO, and brought back one of the ousted board members, a woman named Elena, who had been my father's right hand, to serve as interim president. I realized quickly that I didn't want the corner office. I didn't want to live in a glass tower. My place was designing the culture, ensuring that the roots of the company were healthy, not pruning the leaves. Samantha filed for divorce and started therapy. It wasn't easy. The financial fallout was messy and the emotional scars were deep. But for the first time in a decade, I saw my sister smile, a real smile. Not the practiced grimace she wore for Richard's benefit. 6 months later, I walked out to the parking lot of the nursery where I still worked part-time. The van was there. I hadn't sold it. Instead, I had taken Ito, a specialist. The rust was gone, the engine rebuilt, the body painted a deep, lustrous forest green. It looked classic, sturdy, and proud. It was no longer a symbol of neglect. It was a symbol of resilience. I climbed into the driver's seat. It still smelled like peppermint gum, but the stale tobacco scent was gone, replaced by fresh leather and sage. I opened the glove box and pulled out an old cassette tape I had found under the seat during the restoration. It was labeled Road Trip Mix 98. I pushed it into the deck. There was a moment of static and then my father's voice filled the cab recording. over the beginning of a song. Drive carefully, Mo. You know the way. I smiled, put Thiven in gear, and drove toward the coast. The sun was setting, painting the sky in gold and violet. I wasn't just a gardener anymore. I was the keeper of legacy, and the harvest was finalean. Sometimes you have to play the long game. To protect the people you love. Sometimes you have to let the weeds grow dull just so you can pull them out by the roots. If you believe truth always wins, share this.